Okay, continuing with the Holy Grail of Wisdom quotes by E.P. Rogers. Karl Popper, he lived from 1902 to 1994. He was an Austrian-English philosopher, and he was real famous for talking about the scientific method. He said, science must begin with myths and the criticism of myths. Historically speaking, or very nearly all scientific theories originate from myths. You know, again, it's the idea that we approach the truth asymptotically. We keep getting closer to it, but never quite get to it. Okay, he was a big fan of the ancient Greeks, like anybody who's educated. The War of Ideas is a Greek invention. It is one of the most important inventions ever made. Indeed, the possibility of fighting with words and ideas instead of with swords is the very basis of our civilization, and especially of all its legal and parliamentary institutions. Okay, now some stuff on his theories of science. My thesis is that what we call science is differentiated from the older myths, not by being something distinct from a myth, but by being accompanied by a second-order tradition, that of critically discussing the myth. In a certain sense, science is myth-making just as religion is. Okay, you work towards the truth, you come up with a theory, you criticize it, you discuss it with others, you find out the flaws, the wrong assumptions, and you revise it and keep making it better. Okay, now here's one that's sadly true. No rational argument will have an effect on a man who does not want to adopt a rational attitude. Yeah, so somebody's just made up their mind that they're paleo, keto, carnivore, they don't even want to learn about low-fat vegan. They're not going to change their mind. They're just going to be fixed. Karl Popper, the growth of knowledge depends entirely on disagreement. Knowledge proceeds by way of conjectures and refutations. True ignorance is not the absence of knowledge, but the refusal to acquire it. Yeah, most people don't want to learn. Most people are functional illiterates. They're not going to read anything. It doesn't matter. You know, only if they're about to die, their life's on it, will they maybe consider learning something. But it's just how human nature. Okay, Karl Popper continues. It can't happen here is always wrong. A dictatorship can happen anywhere. The question is not how to get good people to rule. The question is how to stop the powerful from doing as much damage as they can to us. Okay? Karl Popper continues. If we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. Those who promised us paradise on earth never produced anything but a hell. Okay? All right, now he's going to talk about Darwinian theory, Darwinism. And by the way, Darwinism is bogus. Okay, I was an A-plus student at Stanford University majoring in evolutionary biology. I followed it since then. It explains microevolution, variation within a species, okay, and maybe something a little bigger than that, as much as a family. But it cannot explain macroevolution. You know, these big differences in species, speciation, origin of complexity, origin of life, and all that stuff. Okay, here's Karl Popper on Darwinism and evolution. Natural selection is a tautology. The fittest are survive because they're the fittest. Okay. Since the explanatory power of a tautology is obviously zero, something must be wrong here. Evolution is not a fact. Evolution doesn't even qualify as a theory or as a hypothesis. It is a metaphysical research program, and it is not really testable science. If you want to hear people talk about all the problems with evolution, you can watch Dennis Noble, Michael Behe. There's a whole bunch of them. Stephen Meyer, Douglas Axe. Anybody who studied it and is open-minded, you'll see there's a lot of problems with it. It's really sort of been now used as like religion for atheism, okay? A religious story, creation story for atheism. That's sort of what it is. Okay, Karl Popper continues. I shall admit a system as empirical or scientific only if it is capable of being tested by experience. These considerations suggest that not the verifiability but the falsifiability of a system is the criterion. Insofar as a scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. And insofar as it is not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality. Okay, it must be possible for an empirical scientific system to be refuted by experience. And I would say, actually, you know, what he's saying, there's usefulness to it, but a lot of a good scientific theory is just that you take the known facts and you try to put them into a coherent, plausible story that makes sense, that explains things, that you can make predictions from, and the predictions turn out to be accurate. That's useful. You know, for all you know, you could have a Ptolemaic, cosmology. But if it works, it works. And you'll gradually get to a heliocentric Copernican cosmology with Kepler, getting rid of the epicycles. But That's how you work towards the truth. Okay. And not everything is so easily testable and falsifiable. So I think, it's a reasonable starting point to talk that way, but you're dealing with these very big, complex things. And a coherent story is good, especially then you start developing consilience, multiple supporting evidences that indicate it's true, and you can predict off it. Okay, Karl Popper continues. But the secret of intellectual excellence is the spirit of criticism. It is intellectual independence. And this leads to difficulties which must prove insurmountable for any kind of authoritarianism. The authoritarian will in general select those who obey, who believe, who respond to his influence. But in so doing, he is bound to select mediocrities. For he excludes those who revolt, who doubt, who dare to resist his influence. Never can an authority admit that the intellectually courageous is, in other words, those who dare to defy his authority, may be the most valuable type. So that's the problem, like with communism, is that it doesn't allow dissent of any type. So when a new scientist comes along and he says he's got a better theory than the current prevailing one, they get pissed off at him in a lot of instances. And there was this, the guy Lysenko with regard to Mendelian genetics. People could be SHOT for proposing, for saying that Mendel was right and Lysenko was not. So what I'm trying to tell you is you got to be able to have a free discussion if you're going to make progress in science. As Karl Popper had said, to make progress in science, you have to allow debate and discussion. And if the person's interests are sincere about trying to work towards the truth, something useful can come out of it. Sometimes they're just trying to be a jerk, because they're going to lock in because they're trying to sell their product. It's a corporate business interest, and they're not going to want to work towards the truth. So it depends on that context, but the idea is true. You have to want to work towards the truth, both people in the discussion, to make it a useful discussion. Karl Popper continues, it is part of my thesis that all our knowledge grows only through the correcting of our mistakes. The only way to test a hypothesis is to look for all the information that disagrees with it. Okay, here's another good one. The best thing that can happen to a human being is to find a problem, to fall in love with the problem, and to live trying to solve that problem. Yeah, and I think that's why, like I said, I was pretty happy that I'm happy when I'm trying to figure something out. And I'm reading everything about it, I'm trying to put it together. That makes me happy. It gives me something to do. You got to have something to do on the weekend, and for me it's usually trying to write a book chapter, trying to answer a scientific question, trying to study something. And I like doing that. So I'm happy most of the time. Okay, Karl Popper continues. In his intuition, his mystical insight into the nature of things, it is his intuition, his mystical insight into the nature of things, rather than his reasoning, which makes a great scientist. Well, it's both, but they've got intuition because they're constantly studying, so they got these secondary thoughts. Okay, the next quote of Karl Popper. The influence of Plato's work, for good or for ill, is immeasurable. Western thought, one might say, has been Platonic or anti-Platonic, but rarely ever non-Platonic. You could actually divide Western thought pretty much into Plato, Platonic, or Aristotle, Aristotelian, and then other. But that's the big divide, because Plato trends into Protestantism, trends into secularism, trends into collectivism. Aristotle trends into Aristotelianism, scholasticism, Italian Renaissance, Catholicism. Okay. And there's obviously more to it than that, but that's pretty useful. It's like the book, The Cave in the Light by Arthur Herman. So anyways, hope you found that helpful.